Professor, thanks so much for coming in. We're really excited to dive in deep into all things cholesterol and heart disease. I really want to give people an insight into what it's like to see you in both a clinical context and an academic context. So I thought we could start off this conversation by just going through a few definitions, because from my understanding, there is a lot of confusion for folks who hear these terms like heart disease, atherosclerosis, CVD. Why don't we talk about some definitions that people should understand before we dive into this conversation? So what do we mean by atherosclerosis?
So atherosclerosis is referring to the process where, if you think about the blood vessels as pipes, is the buildup of fat over time in the walls of the blood vessels. And the body doesn't like that. So it responds by trying to accommodate that, wall that off, building scar tissue. And that combination of scar tissue and fat in the wall is what we call atherosclerosis. Mm-hmm. And the reason that it's actually so important is, well, there's 8 billion people in the planet. And so if you think about over a period of time, all of this is kind of going on. And when that lining over that atherosclerotic plaque, that area becomes unstable, then when that fat comes into contact with blood, that's when you get a clot forming. Mm-hmm. So if it's in the heart, that would be a heart attack.
Okay. And where else do we get atherosclerosis?
So you can get atherosclerosis throughout the body. Typically, we tend to see it in the blood vessels mm-hmm. that supply the heart. We'll see it in the main pipe, the aorta that goes down the body leaves the heart and essentially branches off and supplies blood to your organs and goes up to your head, down your legs. Typically, when we think about strokes, for example, we think about the two blood vessels, the carotid arteries getting furred or narrowed. Mm-hmm. And then we think about something called peripheral arterial disease, where the blood vessels in the legs get narrowed. And so these are people, for example, that complain of pains in their legs and mm-hmm. their calves when they walk.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And when people hear cardiovascular disease, heart disease, are these interchangeable terms? Are they distinct in certain ways? How do we think through those?
So if you like, some of these are subsets of the other. So heart disease is a subset of cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular is the heart and the blood vessels. So if you're thinking about cardiovascular disease, an easy way of maybe thinking about this is when you think about the heart in particular, there are things that can happen that involve the pipes, so atherosclerosis, mm-hmm. heart attacks, to the blood vessels of your brain, mm-hmm. strokes. You can think about electricity, so the wiring. These are things like irregular heartbeats. So atrial fibrillation, an irregular heart rhythm increases your risk of stroke. You can think about the heart valves, for example, so either leakage or narrowing. And then you can think about the heart muscle. Okay. So all of those would be cardiovascular, mm-hmm. but they have different causes. Yeah. They happen at different ages, different risk factors, different genetic backgrounds.
Okay. So we've got peripheral arterial disease, we've got strokes, we've got coronary artery disease, and we have all these other conditions that are lumped into this heart disease category or cardiovascular disease category. Great. And dyslipidemia.
Yeah, we've not done ourselves huge favors in medicine, have we? So typically when we're talking about dyslipidemia, it's a broad spectrum, because and we can talk about the what you measure in the blood. Typically when we think about dyslipidemia, we're talking about elevations of cholesterol. It can include also elevations of triglycerides, mm-hmm. and it can also include lower levels of something called HDL cholesterol, which lay people would term good cholesterol, but there's no such thing as good cholesterol.
Yeah, let's double click on that point, as we've just talked about good and bad cholesterol, because I hear these terms a lot, even with well-intentioned general practitioners and other folks. Why is cholesterol rather than good cholesterol and bad cholesterol?
So if you think about the what circulates in blood. Fat doesn't mix with water, so cholesterol is carried at a microscopic level, if you will, in something that we call lipoprotein. So they're like spheres. They're like, when you look at these sci-fi sort of movies and you see the atomic scale, it's a big sphere. It's a planet, if you will. At its core, you've got cholesterol or triglycerides. And triglycerides are an energy source. Cholesterol esters, as they're called, are involved in, for example, hormone synthesis. They might be involved in making the walls of your cells, what we call cell membranes. And the best way of thinking about this is there are three main taxes that carry cholesterol towards the artery wall, by causing damage. And there are three particles. One is the low density lipoprotein LDL particle. One is something called lipoprotein A, and one is a particle that contains triglycerides. These are slightly larger, and they also contain cholesterol. And on the surface of all of these, there's a protein called ApoB. So if you like, that's very easy to remember. B for bad, goes in the wrong direction. Then what people call good cholesterol is really referring to a constellation of particles that we term HDL particles. They contain cholesterol and triglycerides, but their job is to try and remove cholesterol from the blood vessel wall, take it in the opposite direction. So that also carries cholesterol, but its role in biology is to do something that's different. So you've got three particles effectively dumping cholesterol potentially in the blood vessel wall, and one carrying it in the opposite direction. But you don't have equal numbers of each of these, and their ability for good or harm varies.
Okay.
Because so think about, for example, so if you take the example of LDL cholesterol and lipoprotein A, we can talk a bit more about that, but our kind of conventional wisdom is, imagine I've got the blood vessel wall is a shooting range. I've got, let's say, 10 bullets. Those are my LDL particles. I've got one lipoprotein A particle, let's say, because it's a much lower concentration circulating. But that one bullet is going to splinter into 100 pieces when it hits the wall. So that's why we think, even though there's less of lipoprotein A, molecule for molecule, it might do 4 to 6 times more harm.
Okay. So we'll get onto this concept of atherogenicity, but the atherogenicity, so the harm potential of an LP little a is a lot higher than LDLC. Am I correct?
That's the current belief.
Okay, fine. So just to clarify, cholesterol is cholesterol. There's no different types of cholesterol. It's just one form of cholesterol. There are different carriers of cholesterol in the body. Key. And the term good cholesterol that's usually assigned to HDL cholesterol is again a bit of a misnomer because we don't fully understand HDL's role in.
And the other thing about that is that came about from a set of studies that were done largely from Framingham. There was this little town in Massachusetts. And what was found was that essentially, if you had higher levels of good cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, your heart disease risk was lower. Then what happens is you look at the bottom, you look at the middle, and you look at the highest group. There weren't many people in that study. And there were only about 300 events. And you can draw a straight line.
Oh, wow.
And then in 2009, we basically showed, when we looked at over 300,000 people, totality of the world data, 25,000 heart attacks and strokes. Actually, it's not a straight line relationship. It's a hockey stick. So and it's what's called an association. It's not causal.
Sure.
At about 1.4, as you get higher than that, you actually don't get any less risk. So you'll see people, for example, women will have a higher HDL cholesterol levels. And when we tend to use ratios, you're underestimating risk because you think a ratio, an HDL of 3 is more protective than a 1.4, and it's not.
But it's not. Okay.
And there's also now some data where very high levels might actually be a marker for sicker individuals who are at high risk of dying. So that whole concept about HDL, low is bad, that's for certain. High doesn't necessarily give you much more protection.
Gotcha. And so, and again, I guess there were drug trials looking at trying to artificially raise HDL.
Absolutely.
So you weren't there, and they were.
So the cleanest of those we've done recently, or colleagues have done recently, giving people infusions straight after a heart attack who had low HDL levels. And so what the belief was that if you basically gave them these infusions, you've got the particles that should capture cholesterol from the blood vessel wall, and then that should help remove the fat. They've just had a heart attack.
Yeah.
That's what the trigger was, and it would make a difference. And it didn't.
Okay.
There are drugs that 20, 30 years ago, a drug class called CETP inhibitors that we originally were developing because we thought raising HDL was good because we kind of had statins for LDL lowering. And what we then realized is actually the same class of drugs also lower LDL, and actually the benefit that was seen in the first of the trials that showed a benefit was related not to the 100% increase in HDL,
right,
but it was to the 20% reduction in LDL. That's the benefit was entirely predictable by that change.
Gotcha.
So basically we've got a lot of our main focus is because you've got essentially more of those bullets, if you will. And there's just at a population level, a lot more of those. That's why largely that's been the main focus. Take that off the table first.
Okay. Might seem like a bit of a silly question, but why don't we get this disease process in veins? Why is it arteries?
Yeah, so there's probably, one of the things about all of this is firstly, the disease process is, there's no single factor that determines this. So one of the things that we need to think about is inherited genetic vulnerability. So when people think about a family history, they think father or mother had very high levels of something, which then they passed on. Probably as common, if not more common, is essentially a whole, not a single variation, but a whole host of genes, variations in those that just make you much more vulnerable to the world around you, which explains why the vast majority of heart attacks at a population level, think about the number of people that have that, have disease like that, will occur in people that don't have extreme levels. There are lots of little things that have added up. It's genes, your best days, your worst days, lifestyle, and how many years you've been alive on the planet. So seeing a little bit of disease in the blood vessels age 75 is very different from seeing the same amount in a 35-year-old.
Sure.
Because, the 35-year-old, if he's got that much already at 35, way more vulnerable.
Yeah.
The outlook's not good. Yet if you get to 75, then you probably are resilient to that same number, all other things being equal. So to question about veins, probably pressure, you need higher pressure systems as well. So if you think about one of the points that we were making earlier on about, think about the blood vessel lining as a footpath, cobblestones. To get into the wall, you've got to get through the cracks. How do you do that? Well, if you damage the arterial wall, so if you've got higher blood pressure, you're going to get more of those particles that are floating around in blood into the wall. If you have diabetes, you make the blood vessels a bit more leaky, more can get in, maybe more is retained as well. If you smoke, same thing. So effectively, your risk of heart disease, heart attacks, atherosclerosis is happening at a lower lifetime cholesterol exposure. So somebody who doesn't have all of those things, the artery wall is less damaged, more resilient. So I need a bigger lifetime exposure. But on the other hand, if you're making that leaky or damaging it, then a small amount just getting through is starting that process. So in veins, we have a very low pressure system.
Gotcha.
And the only way you really get clotting in veins is when you get trauma and you typically damage the veins and the walls and you get inflammation. So usually you get a clot. It's what's happening in the wall, the thickness of the blood, and also the flow.
Okay.
So you have a low flow, thick supply and you've got inflammation in the wall, that's your characteristic sort of DVT.
Okay. Just a quick one. If you want to take your health to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Doctor's Kitchen app. It gives you hundreds of recipes that you can tailor according to your health goals, whether that's inflammation, menopause, improving your brain, increasing your heart health. There are tons of recipes that you can filter according to your dietaries and allergens as well. Click on the link down below and check out the Doctor's Kitchen app. Back to the podcast. And so, as you've alluded to, what are the driving forces behind this atherosclerotic process? So, taking into account genetic risk factors, yes, we'll put those in a box. You got wall damage, and that can come from direct inflammation from smoking particles. So the inflammation related to that. Pressure effects, so high blood pressure creating damage to the endothelial wall. What are the other sort of factors?
Yeah, so typically, if you were to think about smoking, blood pressure, then we need to think also about not just diabetes and basically higher levels of blood sugar levels, but if you like, even in those people who are obese, who are overweight, who are pre-diabetic. So, for example, we just published last week using UK Biobank data, asking the question, is there such a thing as metabolically healthy obese? Because, people have talked about this. Yeah. So what we looked at was arterial stiffness, and that's a marker of vascular health or damage. So you can take people who are overweight and obese, who've got none of the other lipid abnormalities, no elevated blood pressure, no diabetes, and the stiffness of the blood vessels is not normal. Then you can take a group of people who are not obese, who've got those metabolic abnormalities, and it's the same. If you've got both, it's even worse. Okay. So basically, there are a whole bunch of processes that we know. Clearly, blood pressure, high levels of bad cholesterol, and then you've got individual particles as well, like triglycerides containing particles could be more harmful. Lipoprotein A. Smoking, insulin resistance, and inflammation would be the main ones. There may be other things that come out, but we know that about 60% of the heart attacks that occur will be explained by about 5 or 6 of these factors. So pretty much, so the bulk of what we have can be explained. The bit that we don't actually usually factor in very well is time.
Okay.
I.e., how long all of that's been going on for.
Gotcha.
And it's the return on investment principle. If the changes have been there for a long time, then in a more vulnerable individual, those extra decade or 20 years is going to make a real big difference.
Gotcha. So this collection of insults, so damage to the wall, inflammation, and raised lipids. Out of those, is there one that appears to have the biggest impact? I know it's probably a question you get a lot.
So no, we do. And I think that the problem with sort of trying to answer that is everybody's got their pet one to some extent. But if you so a lot depends upon how you interpret the data. So if you said, what's the biggest thing globally? Because there are so many people, and high blood pressure is so common, and a 10 millimeter mercury difference, and you've defined hypertension, that's going to make a big difference. So that would globally be the largest factor. But hypertension doesn't cause cholesterol hypertension, how does the cholesterol get there? It's got to come from somewhere.
Sure.
And there are only 3 particles that are floating around. So you can't get atherosclerosis without cholesterol in the wall, and then everything else happens. But let's say, for example, so we know after flu, you will get inflammation. So now your blood vessels are more inflamed, they're a bit more leaky, a bit more vulnerable, a bit more fat in the wall, a bit more inflammatory cells now get in, trying to deal with it. That area becomes unstable. So that's how basically the body, there's a whole bunch of processes attacking you and a whole bunch of processes that are trying to defend that and heal And that's happening every second, every minute, through every decade and year of your life.
Yeah, yeah. I like this concept of return on investment because I kind of think about it in the same way of smoking pack years.
Yeah.
So the amount of exposure you have to all of these insults. So whether you've allowed a persistent raised cholesterol from your 20s all the way to your 50s, because in your 20s you're like, oh, I don't really need to worry about my cholesterol. That's a later on down the line thing, versus having it treated for a longer period of time. So you're basically giving yourself a higher exposure and increasing the probability of it lodging into the arterial wall. Am I correct in thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is also that the age side of things is not to be underestimated in terms of the benefit. So the best way to think about that is with a couple of analogies. So a lot of people will talk about how many people did you have to treat to prevent one event, so-called number need to treat.
Yeah.
Well, there's a variable there, and that is what was the risk. If there isn't much risk over the next 3 to 4 years, even if something's beneficial, the gains are going to be small. I mean, you need to be at risk. So if you drive, a seatbelt's beneficial, period. But the chances of it saving my life are going to be more if I'm driving every single day at 70 miles an hour rather than a cul-de-sac once a week where the maximum speed is 20 miles an hour. So that's the relative and the absolute. The relative benefit is the same in both scenarios. The absolute is different. And I think that the issue that we have is that people think about having to have symptoms before they've got a problem. So you need a lot of narrowing of your blood vessels, whether it's your legs or your heart, before you complain of chest pain. Supply and demand phenomena, because the body's been able to adapt and cope and accommodate up to a certain level. But that process was going on decades before it shows up. And the worrying thing is that about 50% of people, the first presentation is with a sudden death because of a heart attack, or a heart attack that doesn't kill you. You go into hospital, you open up the blockage, but actually, unless you deal with the problem that caused it in the first place, you're going to come back or the probabilities you're going to come back.
Yeah.
So
I just want to underline that point, because I don't think many people realize that 50%, so it's still 50% of presentations is either sudden death or presentation with a
non-fatal heart attack.
Heart attack.
So if you think about the non-fatal part, how is that captured? Well, if you're somewhere and you're having a heart attack and there is an ambulance to take you to hospital and there isn't a unit to open up, well, you're killing off heart tissue while that artery is blocked. So so there are other factors as well. So if you look at survival from heart attacks has improved. Part of that is better prevention, but part of it is we get people to hospital faster. You open up blood vessels faster, so you survive it. But if you look at rates of heart attacks, they haven't necessarily, we might have seen a fall initially, but then we've seen other things coming in. So diabetes, obesity, for example. So there's always that, are you looking at just it happening, which is when the lining becomes unstable, or you're looking at deaths, because you might survive because I've just got a lot of ambulance in a lot of hospitals. The number of heart attacks may not go down.
Gotcha. Yeah, because a lot of people use this sort of the prevalence of heart attacks and the fact that statins are so readily available over the last couple of years to say, well, statins aren't having as much of an effect as they should be having. And I guess your answer to that would be, well, it's not just about lipid control. There's all these other factors that we are not doing a great job of.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there was a guy. There's not a guy. There were a couple of people that out of the States, in the University of Liverpool, and over decades of looking at trends, they'd estimated about half of the decline in heart attacks that we had seen, or improvement in survival. Half of that were things like systems like, heart attack centers, better ambulance, thrombolysis, clot busting agents, and the other 50% was risk factor control. So the point that you make about statins, so let me give you a salient point. So there's a national registry in Sweden, a small country, and essentially you only actually leave the national register when you die or when you emigrate. So they've got really good data. So if you look at Sweden, and the average age of a heart attack is about 63, 64, let's say 62 to 64. Roughly 75% of people that came in with a heart attack the day, the month, the year before weren't on a statin. So that means the day, the month, the year before, nobody thought this was going to happen, either the patient or healthcare. And so, the concept about statins not preventing, 75% of the heart attacks, they weren't even on those. And then of the 25% that were on medications, for example, when you look at what they came in with, their cholesterol levels weren't too bad, but they had more in the way of risk factors, high prevalence of diabetes. They'd already had a prior heart attack. They were more likely to smoke. So the way of thinking about that is they've still progressed. They're progressors. They're frequent flyers, if you will, despite everything that I'm doing. So that brings you back to genetic vulnerability and time.
Let's talk a little bit about cholesterol versus triglyceride, because we talked about the importance of cholesterol slightly. It's a critical molecule, precursor to steroids, component of cell walls, produced endogenously.
Yeah. So all cells produce cholesterol. This is why people sometimes say, "Well, can my blood cholesterol level get too low?" Well, a newborn is born with a level of about 0.3 to 0.5 millimoles per liter, and when you get into adulthood, 50% will range between about 2.3 and 3.8. So, but your cells will make it. You can get perfect hormone synthesis. If you've got genetic variations that give you really low levels from birth, you get normal fertility, normal IQ, normal development and growth.
Yeah, because there's a lot that we can learn from genetic variants. So people who have naturally low levels of cholesterol
throughout their whole life.
Exactly. Yeah.
Long time.
Yeah. So they don't ever get atherosclerosis if I'm not.
They have a lower risk of atherosclerosis. They basically have normal health and function. They have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, basically heart attacks and strokes.
Okay, but they have normal risk factors for things like cancer and diabetes and all the rest of it. It's just in the realm of CVD.
The protection is against heart disease. Yeah.
Okay, so that is a big pointer for how critical lipid management is in the.
Well, absolutely, and I hear there are some people I've heard that talk about, well, there are 90-year-olds that have high cholesterol, so cholesterol can't be that important. Well, the sick ones all died off. So the ones you get to 90, there's a survival bias. They got to 90 despite it. But all of the other, that says nothing about cholesterol. It's completely misleading.
Totally, yeah. So we can separate the anecdote of folks who have got high cholesterol and have survived despite the high cholesterol, because there's probably something else going on there. And so we have cholesterol.
Triglycerides, you say?
Triglycerides is So where is this created? And
so basically, triglycerides are an energy source. So I mean, molecule for molecule, they'll generate more. Sort of the unit of energy is ATP. They'll generate a lot more than, say, glucose will. And after a meal, typically your levels will go up. That gets packaged in the liver. The liver reproduces a particle that carries a little bit of triglyceride and some cholesterol, and that remodels. And that initial particle is something called VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. That just remodels in blood. It changes, and it becomes the LDL particle. The triglyceride gets taken out. That gets stored in fatty tissue and around your internal organs. And the worry with triglycerides is twofold. If it's really very high, so 10 millimoles per liter, we worry about a condition called pancreatitis. And, that's a medical emergency, really painful, uncomfortable. And you essentially have to look at those people in a completely different light. And so, for example, a lot of those people, they can't handle carbohydrates and saturated, and not saturated fat, but fat and carbohydrates, largely because they have got metabolic disturbances that mean that they can't handle those types of compounds. So blood levels they lack the enzymes. More typically, triglycerides will be higher in people who are overweight or who are diabetic and the diabetes is poorly controlled, or who have a high alcohol intake.
Okay.
And so in that regard, you've got to take away the cause. So a lot of those people, for example, you want to treat the underlying source. So if you lost weight, you would improve insulin sensitivity. If that happened, the liver doesn't produce those initial particles that contain triglycerides.
Mm-hmm.
So you basically have that benefit. Now, at much lower levels, because there's lots of different particles that contain triglycerides, these really whopping great fluffy particles that we call chylomicrons after a meal, they're too big to get into the arterial wall.
Okay.
They get taken up by the liver. But those initial particles that we talked about, the VLDL particles, they are, again, we think about them a little bit like we think about lipoprotein A as being molecule for molecule, a little bit nastier.
Okay.
So possibly twice as much. The issue that we've got is that imagine you go and you get a blood test done. That's a Polaroid. That's a snapshot at a point in time. What's happening is it's a movie, it's a video, and particles are evolving. So when you look up at the night sky, you see a lot of stars. You don't know if some of the ones have been born 1 million years ago or 10 million years ago. So the triglyceride-containing particles are the recent ones, 1 million years ago. And they sit around in blood. They've got a half-life, plasma residence time, we call this, about 6 hours.
Okay.
But the LDL particle, they sit around for about 3 to 5 days. So they're like been sitting around. Those are your 10 million year old stars. So that's why it's really much, much more complex.
Okay. And so that's an interesting insight, because I don't think I've ever thought about that from a perspective of a GP. We always ask our patients to fast for 12 hours before having a standard lipid panel. But if they've been eating fatty food during that week, does it stand to reason that their LDL-C would be raised?
So I think that's a really good question, and I'll give you a slightly laboured explanation. So the real reason for the fasting is so maybe we should start with just explaining a lipid panel.
Yeah.
So in the old days, all we were able to do is measure the total cholesterol. The problem is that's not very informative, because there are all those different bits I was talking about. So you have to separate you precipitate out, you take out the HDL part, you measure the cholesterol cargo. And if you subtract that, then everything else is in those 3 bad particles that we can call non-HDL. So total cholesterol minus HDL cholesterol gives you non-HDL. But that's got 3 components. The vast majority of that will be the LDL particle. Even when lipoprotein A levels are really, really high in terms of concentration, there are fewer molecules, because it's in the nanomole scale rather than millimole scale. So that's not going to give you a whopping great additive increase in your cholesterol level as such. But the triglycerides, when they're high, so whatever the triglyceride is, if you divide by 2.2, that's roughly how much cholesterol that carries. So if it's 10 divided by 2.2 roughly, there's 5 units almost there of cholesterol next to the LDL. So in that scenario, we used to use something called the Friedewald formula. And we use this estimate of if the triglycerides are below about 4.5, divide by 2.2, calculate the cholesterol in the VLDL, and the LDL that you'd report was never measured. It was a calculated level.
Right.
So now what's happened is most laboratories have moved to a different formula.
Okay.
And that's called the Sampson equation.
Okay.
And so that means that you can go all the way up to very low LDL cholesterol levels and accurately predict it.
Okay.
And you don't then get errors. And you could go up to a triglyceride level of about 9.4, 9.6. So now it's just the formula's changed, and it's been validated multiple times with more expensive direct measurements that hospitals can't really run. So we know that calculation is very reasonable. So that means it's great for our patients, because you don't have to worry about the fasting state. And the beauty about a non-fasting measurement is it's a physiological pressure test, because you also want to know when that person goes away. So one of my friends has got this thing called the Tex-Mex diet. And so basically in Texas,
Okay.
on a Friday, you will go, if you've particularly got that genetic tendency towards this, they're fine most of the time. But once they're having a Mexican meal with all of its goodies and a beer, that's when their triglycerides are going to go sky high. And that's when, a lot of these people might be at risk of things like pancreatitis. But, joking aside, that's really helpful. And I know we like to maybe simplify things, but if you know what you're looking at, that full lipid profile, how you manage somebody that's got a high triglyceride who is at risk of a couple of things. There are different triggers, different drivers. You're going to ask about your alcohol intake. Is there a family history of pancreatitis? Are you overweight? And is that, is your hemoglobin A1C? Are you pre-diabetic? You look at all of those things and then you treat that.
Yeah.
And then the triglycerides will go down with that.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, if you've then got, a high LDL and all the other things are okay, that's your primary focus then.
Yeah.
So that's why the full lipid panel really helps us.
Okay. You alluded to it there. Why don't we do direct measurement? Why do we use equations in the first place?
Yeah, partly it's just cost. It's
cost,
labor and time.
Okay.
And I think that was largely why we were using the Friedewald formula.
Yeah.
And that's why you had the whole fasting thing. Then about 11 years or so ago, many places said, let's just use non-HDL because most of non-HDL is LDL.
Yeah.
The problem is that when we had add-on therapies, they were all using trials using LDL cholesterol. So the recommendations would be newer treatments, and that would cost a little bit more. So you have to basically set the bar high if your state's paying for it, but that would be on the basis of an LDL above a certain level. So now imagine a whole country, everybody's just measuring non-HDL, and everybody goes, well, I've got no idea what the LDL is. So now it's actually coming back.
Okay.
And it has been for a little while, because of the fact that essentially those treatments, in terms of how the state pays for it, won't be on the basis of the non-HDL, will be on the basis of the LDL. So actually it's a good thing. And now with the Samson formula, you don't need the direct.
Okay. Well, that's convincing. So in a standard panel today, we have total cholesterol, HDL-C, LDL-C, triglycerides, and non-HDL.
And you get non-HDL
and
reported.
non-HDL-C. Okay. Should we just go through some high-level numbers of what the ranges are for those? So for points of interest, non-HDL-C?
So, well, the thing is, there's no such thing as normal. So the labs will report a normal. So probably the easiest way to think about non-HDL, the difficulty with non-HDL is you have to assume a normal LDL range. So if your LDL, let's say, is 2.3 to 3.8 in about 50% of the population, then your non-HDL will range from about 3 to 4.8 millimoles per litre.
Okay, fine.
Roughly about 30% higher.
Right, okay. And triglycerides?
Yeah, so triglycerides, typically we think about levels below 1.7 as being kind of acceptable, low risk. And, when you get into that 1.7 to 4.5 range, I need to really get out more often. But what I'm visualizing are these, I can see without a microscope what's going on in the bloodstream. And essentially those are people that have got a lot of VLDL, those particles that are carrying triglycerides and cholesterol. And then when you've got somebody that with a triglyceride levels above 10, those are people that are probably producing those chylomicrons, those large particles, and they're not clearing those particularly, and they've got really sky high. So those are people often where the HDL is going to be really low because that goes in the opposite direction. They get less protection now. And their LDLs often are not particularly elevated. It's really high, the triglyceride. So it's, above 10, let's say. So that's a rough estimate
Okay. And in terms of the triglycerides, just so I'm clear, the main driving factor behind high triglycerides is calorie intake, sugar intake, and alcohol. Well, these are three things.
It's a mixture. So there'll be genetics, which will be multiple genes that make you more prone to, well, you're not able to metabolize and remove and clear triglycerides effectively. So, but even if you have that genetic tendency, you need a second hit. And so these are people that tend to be much more sensitive to carbohydrate and also saturated or fats. Alcohol excess is one of the typical ones that we think about in those individuals. And those are the main ones. And diabetes, but poor control
managed.
Of diabetes. So typically, for example, there's a rare condition called familial chylomicronemia syndrome, one in about 1 million people. Really unfortunate, and where essentially these people lack an enzyme called, or they have very low levels of activity of an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. They get recurrent episodes of pancreatitis. Diet and lifestyle can help, but they still get that. But in those individuals, we're restricting your carbohydrate intake to less than 10% and fat intake to less than 10%.
Wow. So they're based on a carnivore diet.
Well, higher protein, but the problem with a lot of the some of the diets that we see is they still get that leakage in of fats in because of the way that they're cooking certain things, etc. But it's really, really restrictive in those individuals. So, but fortunately, it's rare. But that gives you an example of that most things that we see, there's an interplay between genes, environmental factors, of which there are multiple. In some people, they've just got a lot of one environmental or risk factor. But in most people, it's lots of bits of different things. And that's why it's so complex. You've got to address all of these.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about Lp(a) now, because many people haven't heard of Lp(a). It's not on a standard lipid panel. And I'm not too sure what your opinion is as to whether people should at least have one measurement of Lp(a) in their lifetime.
Yeah. So the best way of thinking about lipoprotein (a) is it's one of those, it's like you've got an LDL-like particle and there's an extra protein that the liver produces called ApoA, and it binds to the LDL-like particle. And there are lots of enzymes on the surface of it. And the ApoA part is what is genetically determined. So from the day you're conceived, your level of production of ApoA is genetically determined. So whether you're going to produce a lot of this and therefore your levels will be very high, and levels are fairly constant throughout your life. So in women, it will go up a little bit after the menopause. If you've got kidney impairment, then it will go up. For example, if you have your liver is disease, let's say you've got cirrhosis, but you're not producing as much ApoA, so there'll be a small difference, but the 90% variability in blood is genetically determined. And if you're 20 and you've had it measured and it was plumb normal, it isn't going to go up. Similarly, if it's very high, it's going to stay at that level because we don't specifically have treatments that can lower it. And none of the other things that we have got in the routine lipid panel give you a clue that it's particularly high. So if you don't look, you don't see. And so 20% of people in the general population, white Caucasian population, will have a level above 70 nanomoles per litre, so 1 in 5. And that's where essentially it's sort of almost a very shallow relationship with risk and levels. Then it starts to really go up after 70. And the higher it is, the greater your lifetime risk, also for narrowing of the aortic valve as well, aortic stenosis. And there's a couple of groups of people, for example, so people of Afro-Caribbean ancestry. The way we kind of we talk about the distribution of this, people are bunched together into a narrow range, and there'll be a few people that will have high levels, so we call that a tail. It looks like it's much more normally distributed in people of Afro-Caribbean ancestry. And so their levels, on average, will be higher than a white Caucasians, for example. But a 10 unit change or a 50 unit change from a slightly lower to a slightly higher level will increase their risk of cardiovascular disease, just as it would in a white Caucasian, albeit the starting level is different. So it's relevant as far as we can see in every part of the world. I mean, you know, you might think about, well, why do we need it? And essentially the apolipoprotein A, the protein that codes for it, is similar to something called plasminogen. And we believe that apolipoprotein A increases the stickiness, it increases clotting, for example. So we think part of the reasoning, part of the evolutionary advantage was that if you're going to bleed, so, you know, how true any of this is, but it's a great story, so I'll tell it anyway. So if you think about the time we were hunted by saber-toothed tigers, then you'd bleed. You'd want something that would stop you bleeding to death. And that's what we had. But as we migrated, that's something completely different. As we migrated out of Africa, then the need for that, for example, is less. So in white Caucasian populations, you'll see probably the lowest level, be a little bit higher in South Asians, a little bit in Chinese ancestry, but the highest levels are in people of Afro-Caribbean ancestry. So you'll see I mean, it's really fascinating. So you'll see, for example, in 2 European countries, depending upon the demographics, and you know, we've looked at this in people that have had heart attacks. Colombia, a higher level, but it's got mix. So there's a lot of people from Afro-Caribbean ancestry there, versus Argentina, mostly European. Big difference in levels. Same with Portugal, Angola, versus, let's say, Poland, for example. So it's really interesting because that's kind of giving you an idea of ancestry as well, and you know, and all of these things mixing.
So why is it that we don't, given the heterogeneity, given the association with, and you mentioned aortic stenosis, I'm imagining that if it does increase the stickiness of your blood, you've got high risk of things like peripheral arterial disease as well.
Does.
With LP(a), maybe even kidney disease, kidney stenosis. Why don't we test for it?
So there's one is cost and availability of the test, but it isn't that difficult. 20 odd years ago, it was really more complicated. It was more specialized. Now, most laboratories can do it with, you know, a high throughput assay. And now if you do more testing, the cost comes down as well.
And is this a direct measurement?
It's in what's called, you should use a concentration, and it's what's called an immunoassay. So you basically are locking onto a particular part of a protein and then measuring it after dilution. So one of the things, for example, I think people have argued, well, what do I do about it? All right, well, let's take a step back. Now we've got treatments in people with diabetes that not only lower blood glucose, but reduce their risk of heart attacks. So all of these drugs like sulfonylureas, insulin, never reduced heart attacks and strokes. They improved blood glucose levels, reduced your blindness and your kidney disease, but didn't reduce heart attacks and strokes. But if we took diabetics and we gave them blood pressure lowering agent, wouldn't touch their blood sugar, reduced heart attacks and strokes. If we lowered their LDL cholesterol, we reduced the heart attacks and strokes. We didn't touch anything else. So that's that concept of global risk. So mistakenly, some people, and I've just seen it on Twitter, somebody was giving a talk, and a good friend of mine, he gave a very good talk, and somebody said, why measure it if we can't do anything about it? And that's completely wrong. The reason it's wrong is you address global risk. There are other things that you can do. You take other things off the table and you leave the one that you can't do much about right now. And the first set of trials start being reported next year. There'll be another one in 2027. The one we're starting will report out in 2029. There are about 4 or 5 approaches that will lower lipoprotein A by 80 or 90%.
Oh, wow.
But we've got to basically start now raising awareness. We've got to then explain to both doctors and patients that what we can do right now and what we might be able to do in the future. Plug for Heart UK, superb organisation, lots of reliable information, not myths, available there. And then I think the other part of this is people. I mean, if I think about what scares patients that will see me, then people hear the word genetic and I can't do anything about it. And they'll be more worried about that than their LDL cholesterol, for example, because somehow we've got that mixed up with, oh, it's just to do with bad lifestyle, and not thinking about genetics either. So I think, we need to start making it available in primary care much, much more, because, I know our health service gets really maligned. It's still the best primary care system in the world, and people give their right arm for it. So if we make that available, you want to be able to see your family doctor, you want to be able to have these things, and you want them to know what to do about it. But, we've got to first make the tests available in the first place. And testing is really low. It's probably less than 1% of the population would kind of get tested. And so there's a lot more we need to do in terms of awareness, which hopefully something like this will help with.
Yeah, hopefully. And I think, just for the avoidance of doubt, currently we don't have any treatments to lower LP(a). Is your expectation of the trials that I'm unaware of that if we were able to, that would significantly reduce the risk?
So basically, when there's association, and that's how we used to kind of think about targets for drug development and what might be useful before. What we now do a lot more with, and that's improved our kind of precision, is we use genetics. So if you think about it, you've got, for every gene, there are 2 copies, one from mum, one from dad. And let's say you've got big A, little a, little a, big A, variation. Those are randomly allocated at conception. And because of the work done with the Human Genome Project, it's like doing a randomized trial. So when we do a randomized trial, everything else is the same. One group get A, one group get nothing. And you count bodies. And that's how we do trials over 5 years. So everything that we recommend is on the base of the most rigorous set of trials, and it's not an observational study where there could be some other explanation. So with genetics, because your genes, those alleles are constant, you can look at a small difference in something, but for a long time. And so now what we know is that people genetically with higher LPA levels will have a higher risk of heart disease. Those people with a genetically lower level will have a lower risk. So that gives you confidence that if you can lower it, you should reduce the risk of heart disease. And we don't know. I mean, the reason we don't have treatments available for people is, at the moment, we do not yet know whether lowering lipoprotein A will translate into a reduction in clinical events. But there's a caveat here as well. It's possible, for example, that we'll see a benefit. How much, we don't know. What if we see a trend, but not enough that you can claim, that's how we do trials, statistical benefit? It could be because those trials are being done in people with heart disease, sicker individuals. We've just intervened in the whole process much later. So we need to go longer or have a much larger sample than is being tested. That's why I think it's going to be really helpful having those 4 or 5 different trials. There are treatments that will lower lipoprotein a little bit right now.
Oh, really?
So we have injectable therapies for LDL lowering called PCSK9 inhibitors. And there are PCSK9 lowering therapies, siRNA, so inclisiran, for example. And what they do is effectively the LDL receptors that are on the surface of the liver, and that's how the body lowers or removes cholesterol, that recognizes that ApoB. Now remember, that's on the LDL particle, but it's also on the LPA particle. So if you basically if you diet, you make more LDL receptors. Think about suction cups. If you take a drug called ezetimibe, which reduces cholesterol absorption, you deliver less cholesterol to the liver. The liver says, I want to get more from the circulation. I make more suction cups. When you take statins or a drug called bempedoic acid, within the liver, you shut down cholesterol production. Liver does the same thing, make more suction cups. The problem is this protein called PCSK9 kills off some of these suction cups. So there's less functioning.
Okay.
So if you take a monoclonal antibody, which is an injection every 2 weeks, you're basically putting a big bucket into your bloodstream that's catching the protein, right? So but the bucket's going to get full, it will overflow. So you need to replace the bucket every 2 weeks. And that's why you have 26 injections a year. Alternatively, because 80%, so you might say, well, why don't I switch the tap off? Well, 80% of what's in blood comes from the liver, and that's what we can do with inclisiran, with twice-a-year injection. We can lower LDL cholesterol. But if we basically now lower this protein, whatever suction cups I make, live longer. So now I can get another 50% lowering of LDL. And now when there's less LDL around, maybe some of the LPA is being recognized, and that's how we get 20-25% lowering of LPA.
Gotcha.
So that's the most that we can kind of achieve right now. Some people with these medications might get 40% lowering of LPA. The other way, which is not necessarily the nicest way, so over the road here is the Hammersmith Hospital. It was the first what's called apheresis clinic in the country. And this was for people with sky-high levels of bad cholesterol who didn't have any suction cups at all genetically, inherited faults from mum and dad. And the only way to stop their arteries furring up, babies as young as 5 having heart attacks or bypass operation without a liver transplant, there was no other option. Cleaning the blood every 2 weeks.
Gosh.
So in certain countries, we don't tend to do that as much here. Like in Germany, if you've got sky-high levels of lipoprotein A, and you, let's say, if I had heart disease, you've had a bypass operation, and you're still going on and progressing, then cleaning the blood, if you will, every 2 weeks, taking the lipoprotein A out and other things, that seemed to have been beneficial. But that's not a great way necessarily to spend the next 40 years of your life.
Sure, yeah.
So that's why these treatments that effectively will shut down the production of ApoA with either 12 injections a year or 4 injections a year and bring it down by 80 or 90% might really be useful. There's also one oral medication that we're working on, will lower LDL cholesterol. It's a CETP inhibitor, and it raises HDL, but remember it's an LDL lowering drug. It seems to lower lipoprotein A by 50%. So we'll see. I mean, there's never really been a better time rather, to be interested in prevention, because now with all of these advances, there's so much more that we're actually able to do right now, and so much more on the horizon.
Yeah. So the observation of people with lower levels of LPA comes from these Mendelian randomization studies. Am I right?
Yeah. So genetically, so you want to look at both extremes. You want to look at genetically higher.
Yeah.
And you want to see bad things happening,
yeah,
and you want to see genetically lower and good things happening, and that's what you see, because that's what the drug is trying to recapitulate and copy, bring the high to the low.
Yeah.
And you want to also see when you do that, that it looks, safe as well.
Yeah.
So that kind of gives you something which is called an on-target effect, because that's telling you, if I lower this, that over a lifetime, you're going to run into risk of cancers, because then you might not want to do that with a drug.
Yeah. And with the extra suction cups, you mentioned PCSK9 inhibitors. Am I also right in thinking that these suction cups they're usually recycled, and they're quite energy intensive to actually create these suction cups? So if you do have this protein that's destroying them, that's what's having a double whammy effect.
Yeah. And also, as we get older, our cholesterol levels go up largely because our ability to generate these and regenerate. Right. So, people will say, oh, I've been on medication X for years. Why is it going up?
Why is it going up?
But, you're 20 years older now.
Okay.
And so the ability of what that can do, but for a lot of people, that won't be the case, but it will for some.
Okay. And even if one was to change their diet to reduce the amount of dietary cholesterol that they're consuming. I know that dietary cholesterol isn't necessarily related to your blood cholesterol, but you're reducing, let's say, your saturated fats and anything that could be raising LDL-C. Is that going to have a significant effect in your opinion? Have you seen that clinically?
It will. So the blood level. So think about your blood cholesterol level as your sink. You've got a drain pipe and you've got a tap. And the level of the water is going to depend on what's coming out and how much is coming in. So it's dynamic.
Sure.
So people think about, well, if I take a saturated fatty meal or a lot of saturated fat, that's what's directly pushing my blood levels up. And that's wrong. What happens is that if you take a higher saturated fat meal and you deliver more cholesterol to the liver says, I've got enough cholesterol. I don't need to collect it from blood. It will downregulate the production of the suction cups. So if I'm not removing cholesterol from the blood, what's going to happen to my blood levels? It will go up.
Yeah.
That's the link.
Okay.
If you do the opposite and you basically reduce that, you're reducing the delivery of cholesterol to the liver, and therefore you make more suction cups. So the biggest determinant really of your blood levels are how many of these suction cups, and it's under dynamic control. You've got opposing processes, and you've then got PCSK9 killing it off as well, etc.
Yeah.
So, and that's also regulated by your diet to some extent. So there's a counter. If I produce more, I'm going to produce more PCSK9. It's going to kill some off to make sure I don't overproduce, and it goes the other way. And the LDL receptor is really important because 1 in 311 people, and that's, you know, one of the reasons that we've kind of championed screening newborns or early life, is that 1 in 311 people is going to be born with essentially from mum or dad passing on a gene where either the suction cups are faulty or they've got fewer suction cups. So their LDL cholesterol, remember I was giving you those normal ranges?
Yeah.
Right. At birth is going to be around about 4 millimoles per litre instead of 0.5.
Wow.
So you think about 20 years, think about pack years and cholesterol years. And it doesn't usually cause any signs or symptoms until they present, often in their 40s if they're male, with they've had a blood test and the cholesterol sky high, or they've had a heart attack. If it happens in a girl, for example, because women get a bit of natural protection anyway, they often have this, but they'll present later. So often people will say, oh, well, that's just age, isn't it? Rather than thinking about this. So if that person then has children and pass it on to the son, often it's going to be missed. So that's the thing. If somebody has that, then the children will have a 50% chance, heads or tails, of having the same thing. So if you find the parent, you can find the children. That's how we've traditionally done it. But we've probably picked up less than 10% of the people that are carrying this in the UK.
Wow.
And, you know, so one way would be the adults, for example, should have those health checks and things that that the government offer. Yeah. The NHS health checks. If you did newborn screening, for example, you'd pick up 1 in 311. That means one of their parents would be the person that passed it on. But the age of the parents is going to be probably in their 20s, which means you've got time now. Yeah. If you find them now, instead of what we found, when you look at the global average age of detection is 44 years. That's 44 years of missed opportunity. Less than 2% were found before the age of 18. So, and by that time, often they've got cardiovascular disease. Yeah. So, you know, time really matters.
Yeah. What would you be screening for, sorry?
LDL cholesterol. LDL. But I mean, at the same time, you could do LPA.
Yeah.
You know, it makes so much sense because the other thing is when you look at LDL later in life, there's a whole bunch of other things that could contribute. So, you know, your LDL could go up because of diet and lifestyle, pushing it up a little bit. But as a kid, or as an infant, before the age of 10, if it's really high, it's going to be genetic.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so hopefully you've convinced everyone to spend the extra 30, 40 pounds getting an LPA if they can't get it from their primary physician. ApoB containing lipoproteins. What are your thoughts on these? So these, just for the listener, these are tags, would you say, or proteins that are on the atherogenic lipoprotein. So your LDLs, your IDLs, your VLDLs. And this is a specific blood marker.
Yeah. So essentially, think about the spheres, and so basically, just trying to think about the best analogy. All right. So you take the planets in our galaxy. And so those
you
are
like physics, don't you?
Astronomy.
I could tell.
So imagine if we had on each of those planets, for example, and they're different sizes, right? The planets, Jupiter, Earth, etc., all different sizes. But let's say they all had one glacial pole, like Antarctica, and only one.
Okay.
So effectively, you could, count the volume of each of those, or you could just count the number of those. And so where it helps is in people, I think it's useful, but it's, if you know what you're doing, it doesn't add that much more, because effectively a high ApoB is telling me the triglyceride fraction, which is IDL, VLDL, the LDL fraction. It's less informative about lipoprotein A, even though there's one tag on each of these particles.
Okay.
And it's basically something that the LDL receptor recognizes. So, I was using the suction cups.
Yeah.
So when the LDL receptor removes cholesterol-containing particles, that's the bit it recognizes.
Okay.
And that's how it then says, right, I'm going to take it into the liver.
So it recognizes that ApoB. Okay. And so I think you were just about to say it's less useful than.
So I think if you can either use non-HDL, which is the total cholesterol. So you can either count the number of taxes or the number of people in the taxes.
Okay.
And if you know what you're doing, you're going to get the same information.
Okay.
They're highly correlated, right? The difference is if you said, on some days, all the taxes could be black. On another day, some of them could be Ubers as well. And so, that's the analogy. So for the vast majority of people on a given day, most of it is in one particular form. But for certain other people, there are other contributing factors. And that's where you either use non-HDL or you use ApoB. Why is that? Because you will underestimate the number of bad particles, because there's a bit more there that is not in the LDL. But if you knew and you recognized a high triglyceride, ApoB will be higher in that person. Non-HDL will be higher in that person. So,
okay. Are there any other blood markers that if you were, I don't know, czar of lipidology in the UK, that you would add to the standard lipid panel? Or do you think this gives us enough, in the majority of cases, enough information about someone's risk profile as it pertains to lipids?
So I think at the moment, if we basically made sure that all the laboratories had the Samson formula, I think some still don't.
Oh, right.
But I think in London, the vast majority do. And it's just programming into the pathology system computer and getting them to do that. And that's fine. I think LPA needs to be around in the entire country. You don't need to keep measuring. You just need to measure it once and it's either normal or not. And so I think that's the key thing. We are always, you are going to find different things that increase your risk. So I probably should have said it wasn't on my radar initially. So for example, heart disease risk is higher in people with chronic kidney disease. So you often don't know that unless you measure something called EGFR. And so that's useful. At 40, you wouldn't expect that. And let's say everything else is okay, but at 60, you have some infections or viral illnesses that damages your kidney or something else. Now your risk has gone up. So it's not the same as it was in your 40s. And the other thing I think now, I'll still see this with patients is that hemoglobin A1C is not always kind of measured, and people still, there's a lot of use of for diet and lifestyle, the glucose monitors that you see. They say, oh yeah, but I was using that, and it was okay. But that's only one point in time. Hemoglobin A1C is the last 3 months, and it's an average of your good days and your bad days, rather than the one that you're picking. I think there is another one that will come out, which is, you talked a little bit about inflammation. So inflammation there are two things. One is, if you get cholesterol into the blood vessel wall, your body responds. Inflammation is body's way of trying to heal. So it responds by being more inflamed and trying to deal with that. But you could also have an inflammatory condition. Patients with rheumatoid arthritis, HIV will have a slightly higher risk of cardiovascular disease than those without, for example. And there could be a direct effect of damaging the lining of the wall that accelerates that process. And then you've got the inflammatory response in the vessel wall itself. So a few years ago, we knew something called high CRP. We can see down a microscope lots of white cells in around cholesterol plaques, and whether it's your neck, down your legs, in the blood vessels of your heart. And so people, have talked about this and been interested in this. And we've not had any direct ways of really targeting this. And a few years ago, there was a trial done with a compound that was targeting. There's a set of proteins that are called cytokines, and they drive inflammation. So we sometimes use this measure called CRP. That's not a cause, it's a downstream measure of lots of things. So if you're overweight, your CRP is going to be high. If you've got a low HDL, a high triglyceride, high glucose, you smoke, your CRP is going to be high. So what it does is, in the body, there's like a master sensor, and it's called the NLRP3 inflammasome, and it's detecting lots of stressors in the body. And it responds by producing a set of proteins called cytokines, interleukin-1 beta, interleukin-6, and these cause inflammation, main drivers. We showed basically, or colleagues showed, that targeting inflammation by targeting IL-1 beta reduced cardiovascular events by about 15%. So no more or less than we'd seen with other approaches, but it was on top of everything we were doing.
Right.
And so that suggests that inflammation is causal.
Yeah.
The problem with dampening down on inflammation is you kind of need inflammation to fight infections and other things. Your infection rates went up, and it was an expensive treatment as well.
What kind of treatment were we talking about?
So it's a monoclonal, 4 times a year.
Okay. So something that we give autoimmune patients. Yeah. Okay.
And so it sits around. But now we know autoimmune patients, when we suppress the immune system, we're targeting other things like TNF alpha, etc. Yeah. We know some of them might be more prone to infections as well. So that's the downside of that. Below interleukin-1 beta is interleukin-6, and that's currently being tested in a clinical trial at the moment, where you take people who are inflamed, a high CRP, history of cardiovascular disease and renal disease, because it seems to be the risk seems to be higher, and seeing actually whether giving these people this anti-inflammatory approach reduces their risk of heart attacks and strokes. It's also being looked at in people with heart failure, because inflammation is part of so many different processes. And if you like, is your normal response exaggerated, like in people with rheumatoid arthritis, for example, you continue to damage the joint. So if you can suppress that, but in a highly targeted way, is that beneficial? So that may be something that we can add on in those individuals.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, for example, weight loss. The biggest producer of interleukin-6 is adipose tissue.
Right, yeah.
And so if you lose weight, CRP goes down, inflammatory markers go down, and that might be how some of the drugs, the GLP-1 agonists, give cardiovascular benefit, because they will give you some blood pressure reduction, a little bit of improvement in lipids, but there may be some direct effects on inflammation itself as well.
So the markers that might be coming to market,
CRP would be the one. Yeah.
Okay, so HSCRP.
HSCRP rather than because essentially it's really very small. So if you have a cough, a cold, a flu, the CRP will go high.
Yeah.
And we're talking about levels here, just above 2 milligrams per liter. So 2, 3, 4, that will give you a higher risk.
Yeah, yeah. And are there any others that are more sensitive or skewed more towards the risk profile for cardiovascular
Well,
disease?
the ideal would probably have been interleukin 6, but the
Okay.
problem is with that is it's going to be really quite expensive.
Uh-huh.
You've got to handle the samples in a particular way.
Yeah.
So if you basically, take a blood sample and you stick it
Mm.
on a shelf, it'll degrade. So you kind of need -80 and handling very, very carefully because you'll get a natural degradation. So we use it for research and we can write nice papers with it and, we get more information. But routine clinical use, we're not there yet. But then in terms of other markers, so one of the biggest revolutions was NT-proBNP for heart failure.
Yeah.
So basically just lots and lots of work that was done with that so when your heart muscle gets stretched, when it's dilated, it's failing. In that situation, NT-proBNP levels go up. The heart is trying to release a protein that essentially is helping wee out fluid so you don't overload. So levels of that we know are used for heart failure. When you come in with a heart attack, how do we distinguish between somebody with a non-cardiac issue from a heart attack? We can detect tiny amounts of heart muscle damage with something called troponin T or I. And so, but those in routine screening, let's say, probably we wouldn't be using. We use NT-proBNP for heart failure, breathlessness.
Yeah.
Troponin T, probably not. So I think really the one that we'll see more of, particularly if we have a treatment for those people who are inflamed, if you will be HSCRP.
With regards to the anti-inflammation trials, so ones using monoclonal antibodies to dampen inflammation, are there any trials looking at either nutraceuticals or things like omega-3, high-dose omega-3 to reduce inflammation?
That's a good point. Okay, so we have got, omega-3s came out largely as triglyceride-lowering drugs. And years ago, we had a lot of trials that were kind of pre-statins, and there was a famous study called Giuseppe Prevencioni that showed survival benefits, but very few people were on conventional treatment. So then when those studies were reproduced, we found basically that we didn't see the same benefit when background treatment and modern standard of care had changed. So then the question is, well, is there any benefit in that? But we would typically see, even when you control LDL cholesterol, blood pressure, if you've got high triglycerides, you've got a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And we'd seen typically with higher doses of fish oils, omega-3s, there are two types. There's EPA and DHA. EPA comes from fish. DHA comes from seeds, linoleic acid, essentially. A lot of the stuff that you see over the counter, the dosage is really low. Probably does no harm. But what we've done is multiple sets of trial. So the first thing is that the conventional combinations of DHA and EPA that we have available don't give you any added benefit in terms of heart attacks and stroke prevention. The second thing is when we've looked at absolutely pure EPA. So we did a trial called Strength, where we reduced triglycerides, reduced ApoB, reduced CRP, reduced LDL a little bit, reduced triglycerides a lot. Not a sign of benefit. So
how long was that trial?
So 3.5 years, about 13,000 people. We didn't see a benefit for that. Doesn't mean that lowering triglycerides is not good for pancreatitis, but it meant that, that didn't show a benefit. But at the same time, there were colleagues that did a trial called Reduce It using a different formulation. And that was 4 grams of a really ultra purified fish oil called icosapent ethyl. And they looked at people with high triglycerides and low levels of HDL, already well managed otherwise, and they found a 25% reduction in heart attacks and strokes. The amount of benefit that they got was disproportionate to the changes in triglyceride. So that means that there must be something else. That's giving you that benefit. And with further work, what people have done now is essentially they've looked at how different types of fish oils, where they sit in the cell membrane. So cell membranes have a natural, it's a bilayer, if you will. So they kind of look like tadpoles facing each other, but a number of these. And this seems to sit at certain particular points within the bilayer, whereas other compounds don't. And within that whole process, there's a natural process for resolving inflammation, and those are called resolvins.
Yeah.
And if you basically enhance icosapentaethyl and EPA, you probably enhance the natural inhibitors of inflammation in the vessel wall. So what everybody's interested in is what determines the benefit if it's not the triglycerides. And we know we've had at least 3 studies where we've seen that the drug itself, even with a slightly lower level, still gives benefit. So it matters what you give and the amount you give. So we're basically starting, we've just had the first site visit of one of the sites. Hypothesis is you take people who have got inflammation in the vessel wall as measured by something called the fat attenuation index. And that's basically like looking down a microscope with a times 100 lens. If you use a CT scan, a standard angiogram is like a times 10. You've got to have a lot of disease before you'll see anything. If you look at the walls with a calcium score, that's like a times 50 lens. But this is actually giving you another level of granularity. And the hypothesis is if you take people with a high triglyceride and they've got inflammation in the vessel wall, and I give half the people this compound, which is available, versus usual care, do I attenuate, do I dampen down on that inflammation? Because if that is the case, then we answer that question, and then we can go on and do a bigger, more definitive study. So we're just starting that.
Do you take fish oils?
No, but I do take a lot of fish.
Oh, do you? Okay.
My triglycerides are not elevated.
Okay. That's good to know.
But I have been taking statins for over 10 years.
Right. And that has an anti-inflammatory effect as well, right?
Yeah, it does. So it does have an anti-inflammatory, but you got to be a
bit.
little bit careful with that. So we know, for example, in test tubes, it will do it. It will reduce inflammation. What people typically think about reducing inflammation is looking at C-reactive protein and lowering that. Statins and this drug, bempedoic acid, they reduce, the liver makes CRP, and the statins themselves actually reduce the production.
Okay.
So something could reduce CRP and reduce the marker, but not work upstream and reduce inflammation. It probably does have a slight anti-inflammatory effect, but nowhere near the amount of the treatments that are being tested.
Gotcha. There was another marker I was going to ask you about, oxidized LDL. This is something that I've seen on private blood tests. Does this have any correlation with the degree of risk and inflammation as well? Oxidized LDL?
So the working rule of thumb is that LDL gets oxidized and then it's more pro-inflammatory. So, but if I've got, let's say, 100 units of oxidized LDL, well, it only got there because I had a lot of LDL.
Right.
So if you have a lot of LDL, you've got more to oxidize.
Sure.
So I don't ever use it. I mean, it's great for writing a paper, but for practical utility, what would you do? Because all the trials of antioxidants ever done that looked at vitamin, high doses, antioxidants, didn't make an iota of difference. So if you want to reduce the amount of oxidized LDL you've got in your blood, reduce the amount of LDL to oxidize.
Yeah. There is some controversy around that point around reducing LDL-C. So there's many patients that still experience these major adverse cardiovascular events despite having normal levels of LDL-C. Maybe this is where we could talk a bit about residual risk. I know we've already talked a bit about, looking at patients holistically, from an inflammatory perspective, genetic perspective as well. But perhaps we could address that directly, because I think a lot of people use that as a reasons to discount statins overall. So
we've got to remember, so I'll give you an anecdote. So my boss, when I was at Harvard, so when I went over and, there's my CV and I'm applying for grants, the British Heart Foundation, which I eventually got, and went over to the States, and I had to have his CV, to put this in. And he's got a lot of papers, and he was a one-page CV. And the last line of that was, his name was Eugene Bromwald, and just turned 95, still going.
Gosh.
And was the living Nobel laureates have voted this person as person who's contributed the most to medicine in the last century. And that was the guy I worked for 2 years. And that was the guy that was my referee for all of my first jobs back in the UK when I came back. So in 1994, we had definitive proof with the first statin trial called 4S in survivors of heart attacks. They had to survive 4 to 6 months. So, the really sick ones died off, but they'd survived and the cholesterol levels were high. And they were treated with simvastatin. And we showed for the very first time the cholesterol lowering not only reduced heart attacks and strokes, but because these people were so at risk. So think about deaths. You can die of heart disease, cancers, infectious disease, trauma, infection, all of those things, right? In different proportions. But if the major reason I'm going to die is if like 50% of my deaths are cardiovascular, I'm going to impact all-cause mortality. So because these people are so sick, effectively at that time, levels were really high, not much in the way of anything else, they were able to show a reduction in all-cause mortality. And the guy that was reporting this trial was a famous guy from Norway called Terry Petterson. And I remember, years ago, he'd done the 4S trial, which was 4,444, then did the Ideal trial, which was 8,888. How they got exactly those numbers, I don't know. But he tells the story about when he was sitting and he presented this the day before they presented the American Heart Association. It was 40 years just gone. Dr. Braunwald, one hand went up. Why wasn't it better? And, you're sitting there thinking, I've just shown the world that we reduce all-cause mortality. What do you mean it wasn't better? I used to think that was just an anecdote. And you'd go back and you'd go back and you'd go back and you look at the data. So the interesting thing that we have seen now is if you so nature doesn't care how you lower LDL cholesterol. Uh-huh. We've had 5 different ways of lowering it, all of which in clinical trials have shown you reduce cardiovascular disease. So the common theme is LDL, nothing else, in terms of how those drugs work. There's nothing else for that. There are other things that contribute as well. Sure. The next part of that is how late did I start? So who do we typically start and do trials in? The sickest?
Yeah.
The most diseased? So if you start at the average age of 60 in those trials and you treat for 5 years, you're not going to undo everything in a short period of time. So if you look at cholesterol lowering trials per 1 millimole, on average, you get 22% risk reduction. And that's almost uniformly true, except in one case and one scenario. And that's when you look at people who have not yet had cardiovascular disease. So when you look at people with annualized rates less than 1% per year, 1 millimole gives you nearly 40% risk reduction. And as the event rates go up, why did you get events? You got more plaque. How did you get more plaque? More atherosclerosis. How did you get more atherosclerosis? Genes, risk factors, and years lived. The return on investment diminishes. Yeah. So now, even in a primary prevention patient, if your annualized risk is more than 6% per year, the return on 1 millimole is 17% risk reduction. So I need 2 millimoles if I want 40%, right? So that basically, I think, is the explanation. The residual risk, in part, is 1, the disease is multifactorial. Yeah. 2, how late we start. Yeah. And for most things, the earlier we've started, we've got a much bigger return on investment because there's less disease. It's more plastic, whether it's blood pressure, whether it's LDL, whether it's smoking cessation, for example, because you've just got a lot less of it around. Yeah. The later you start, you're going to need a Lazarus effect. And, you usually tell my patients that, look, we're going to have to try and claw back. You've come to see me age 60. Yeah. There's so much I can do. Yeah. But what we're trying to do is claw back time. So, imagine being a 50-year-old. I've seen plenty of these in the last week. Fit, healthy, exercise, no symptoms, probably got an occupational check. And that's something the general public should do. Take up the NHS health checks. Yeah. They're free. And these people have had a check of some sort, maybe gone on to have further investigations. And, I was talking about the coronary artery calcium score. So we'll use imaging. That's that times 50 microscope rather than looking at narrowing times 10. Now it's got a lot of sensitivity. So telling somebody in a room of 100 men, their age, their rank as number 98, only 2 worse hearts than them.
Yeah.
But then looking shocked. LDL, other risk factors, not that abnormal. But the problem was that it was abnormal for them because they were genetically more vulnerable to accumulation and retention of cholesterol-containing lipoproteins in the wall.
Yeah.
Some of them might have high lipoprotein A as well. Some of them might have that mixed picture of triglyceride. Some of them might have really low HDL cholesterol levels. So white Western male, 1.24 is your HDL, female, 1.44. So if I see somebody with an HDL of 0.9, like I said, I need to get out more often. Essentially, I'm seeing 30% higher risk.
Yeah. The NHS health checks, they start at age 45, right?
40 to 74. In some places, they brought it down a little bit more.
Gotcha.
But, last week there was a report saying they're underutilized. There'll be a report this Sunday in the Mail talking about, why. And again, it's this misconception. I feel fine.
Yeah.
I exercise and nothing could possibly happen to me. But the problem is that there are some people with undiagnosed levels of risk factors that are contributing.
Yeah.
And you'll find certain things that will come up. And the health checks actually add all of these bits together with a risk calculator. They're not necessarily going to do imaging for you, but essentially at least taking into account a family history, taking into account different bits that none of us are going to be able to add up in our head. We have to, punch them into a algorithm that gives you a predicted probability of cardiovascular events.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important that people think about taking those up.
In an ideal scenario, putting aside the monetary constraints on our healthcare system, it sounds to me that we should be really encouraging younger patients in their 20s to at least get their lipids checked and their inflammation scores, if that's available to them, checked as well, and engaging them to have an anti-inflammatory lifestyle and take medications if required.
Well, it goes back to that analogy. Remember I was talking about the determinants in childhood?
Yeah.
That if you take a school full of kids and you measure blood pressure, cholesterol, waist circumference, etc., they're not going to be particularly high, but there is the distribution for that room. So if you're in the top 20% for each of these and you add those up, they're the ones that get the heart attacks in their 30s and their 40s before everybody else does. So what's the difference? It was already there. The events didn't happen in their 20s or 30s. But if we educate, so that's called primordial prevention, prevent the determinants of risk factors which cause cardiovascular disease. So risk factors cause cardiovascular disease, stop the risk factors from developing. So, that basically means diet, exercise, safe spaces. It's always humbling when we come from a country like this, when, I've had conversations with people in Latin America said, but what about if your kids are playing somewhere and there are gangs? So if you think about it, all of these things are interlinked and it's so important, but it has to start in childhood because actually a small change in everybody, but maintained, pushes that trajectory of disease out.
Yeah.
And then the point that you made in your 20s or 30s, have another check. Whatever you were doing 20 years ago, maybe things have changed. And then at that point, if you didn't have your lipids checked earlier on, blood pressure checked, etc., then you should do that. And then probably again, because other things change, your metabolism changes, weight goes up, maybe blood pressure's gone up. So your risk profile is changing throughout your life. And if you need it, then don't be frightened of the medications in terms of doing it early. Because you probably need a lot less as well. Starting late, you're playing catch up. You're more likely to need more than starting early.
Yeah. I personally get my lipids checked yearly. I don't know, because obviously this is going to be costly for the NHS Health Service. I think
It's typically every 5 years. So if everything's okay,
Yeah.
so you get dietary advice, lifestyle advice, you look at the changes, then if medication's needed,
Yeah.
you'll do that. But if you were low risk on that health check, then it will be in 5 years' time.
But if you're a proactive individual, let's say, and you're happy to pay out of pocket, in an ideal scenario, would you say as often as
I think it depends upon what the levels were. So I think if you were really kind of plumb normal, or really at the low end, there's no such thing as really normal, but you've got a good family history, etc., you could push it out every 2 years.
Okay.
And that would be reasonable. If there are big lifestyle changes, you suddenly notice you've gained weight, etc., then you do it. But once a year, if you can certainly afford that.
Yeah.
But otherwise, every 2 years would be reasonable.
I want to talk briefly about imaging. We've alluded to a couple of imaging studies, the fat attenuation index, for example. What would you say would be reasonable? Let's say you have an individual that comes in, 50-year-old, fit and healthy, has had cholesterol, but it's been untreated, let's say, high levels of LDL-C for a number of years because they didn't like statins or they were against it for whatever reason. What kind of investigations would you suggest, assuming that money's no object, let's say, in this individual?
Yeah, so I think with those people, what we're interested in is their risk of atherosclerosis, and you want to know how much disease have you got based on the last 50 years, genes, environment, and time.
Yeah,
and we know that some furring will not be calcified.
Yeah.
So the CT angiogram is very helpful for looking at that. But at the same time, we can do a coronary artery calcium score. And those are kind of routinely available around the country. And they tell you different bits of information. The calcium score ranks you in a room of 100 people your age. So that gives you a relative distribution of risk, which I think actually for patients, they find it really quite helpful, telling them that they're in the bottom 25%. What that basically means is that actually I've got more time. So in that person, I wanted to go with the CAC score is 0, short-term risk is really low. I can basically think about diet, lifestyle, you can think about nutraceuticals, and you can then basically now invest a little bit, but maintain for a long period of time. On the other hand, if you're number 95 in the room and your LDL's 4, if I bring that down with a statin to 2, let's say, or if you were able to do it yourself, down to 2, your risk has come down 40%. So I'm bringing you more into the middle of the room, basically towards the 50th percentile now. But for a lot of people, that's not going to be enough. And you might want to bend the curve even more. So now I'm thinking of bringing it down to 1 millimole. So that's now 55% relative risk reduction. So I'm now bringing them into the bottom part of the room, for example. And that's where you can kind of personalize it. I think what we will see, so if you like, the level of detection, if your CAC score is high, possibly other things, you don't need to think about that much more. But on the other hand, because you're already going to make that decision to do something about it in those individuals, but there's going to be some people, when you've done the CT and you don't see any furring of the blood vessels, and that's why I was saying that times 10 lens, then you go to the times 50 and that's your CAC score, and that's also 0, and you say, all right, you're in the bottom 25%. But then that fat attenuation index, looking at inflammation in the walls of the blood vessel, that gives you another level of granularity, even if the other two are reassuring. And that was the example I was giving you about, a patient of mine where essentially came to see me because there was a family history, grandparents in their 70s, and family, but left a mark in that saw debilitation because of what had happened. Parents didn't have a problem, but he was always health conscious, and essentially all the others were normal, but the fat attenuation index put that person as the 83rd percentile in having sampled a lot of people, if you will. So 17 worse than him, and he's worse than 82. So that basically, for that person, made a big difference. They'd also got genetic testing, etc. done. And on the polygenic score for vulnerability, they're like 97th percentile. So even though the LDL was 2.2 or 2.4, the LPA was very slightly elevated, the biggest determinant was that genetic vulnerability.
Right.
So in that particular individual, their desire was, that process that might lead me into my 70s to have that, or before that, I want to bend the curve and do something about it now. So that's how it was kind of personalized for that particular individual. And what's interesting is there's that 83rd percentile, but there's context as well. Because even with those numbers, their 8-year risk of dying from a cardiovascular event in the 40s was 1.3%.
Mm-hmm.
But in the next decade, it's not linear, it's exponential. So if you basically think about what the risk of dying would be if we did nothing, it'd be 1.3 times 1.3 times 1.3, that's 2.197. Doubled in your 50s. If you do nothing in your 50s, 2.197 times 2.197 times 2.197 into your 60s is now 10% chance of dying. 1 in 10. And that's 20 years of doing nothing. And that's not something that wasn't taught that way at medical school. If you'd asked me if I was talking like this at medical school, I hated all the stuff that was, it was so dull, it was taught so badly. And it's basically understanding that quantitative part and how all of those things link together in the biology. That basically, you know, when you see those little numbers, they mean a lot. If you know what you're doing, that you can basically explain risk in a way that a lot of people find it hard to understand, in a way that's relatable. And analogies, I think, really help in that regard, because it's got to be relatable to them. And so, you know, and that's the real problem. Our biggest problem, we talk about cardiovascular disease being the silent killer. And the problem is it's silent until it isn't.
And we were talking before, you know, you can't feel high cholesterol, you can't feel moderately raised blood pressure, you know, but over time, this will culminate in...
It's a slow burning process, that's the problem. And it's insidious and it creeps up on you. You know, and most people, if you think about, I mean, so for example, the health checks, the underutilization, you know, we've got to recognize we've come out of COVID, cost of living, all of those things that aren't their life. You know, we're humans, their life. And there's a whole bunch of people that are working to make ends meet and challenging circumstances. And when they feel fine, do you honestly think that they're going to worry about this until they aren't? Then they're going to see a doctor. And that's not what really health systems should be about. It should be about preserving health. But that basically means you've got to speak the language of those people, to bring those people in, to engage with those people in a better way than we've done.
Do you think stress has an impact on inflammation?
Directly and indirectly. So stress will put blood pressure up, so arterial wall injury. Stress will also alter your immune system and can drive inflammation up, so you get transient spikes. So yes, it will be a contributor. Hard to quantify. But yes.
Really interesting. I'm going to close, but just asking you a couple of quick questions. But I'm conscious that this probably isn't a very simple answer. So if somebody can't tolerate statins for whatever reason, so you put them on different statins, they have symptoms associated with those, where else would you go? What other medications would you
so the typical thing with statins, so before we had other options, what we used to do was try a different one, the lowest dose, alternate days, twice a week, even once a week. So you don't get the full effect, but you get some lowering, and that gives you some benefit. Now we've got other drugs. There's a drug called ezetimibe, gives you 20-25% lowering, reduces cholesterol absorption from the gut. There's a drug called bempedoic acid, which gives you 18 to 25% lowering. It works in the same pathway as statins, but it's not taken up by the muscles. So you don't get that particular side effect. About 1% of people might get gout with that, but if you stop it, that goes away. Then we've got injectable therapies at the moment, and we've got two types. One is every PCSK9 inhibitors, monoclonals, 26 injections a year, self-injected, inclisiran, which is 2 injections a year, which a healthcare professional injects. And the last two, the monoclonals give you 58% lowering of cholesterol. Inclisiran gives you about 52. The statins can give you around 50% lowering at the higher doses.
Okay.
So essentially we use a bit like hypertension. Side effects with statins tended to be more with the higher doses. If you'd asked me 15 years ago, we were using the highest doses a lot more. Now, if my patients don't tolerate something, that's no good for them, that's no good for me. So we often use a lot more of combination therapies. And for some of these, they are available at fixed dose combination, bempedoic acid. There's a fixed dose one with ezetimibe. The two together give you 40% lowering. So that's great for people who can't tolerate statins. Then you've got obviously the injectables and so forth. There are cost differences with those.
Sure. Are there nutraceuticals that you alluded to? That
So
might be
typically, so there's a couple of caveats. So red yeast rice, 1.2 grams, together with plant sterols. And the problem is that they're not studied and quantified in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
But on average, you might get about 17% reduction with a good diet as well. And 17%, starting at a higher level, is quite a big amount.
Yeah.
You know, if we did that with a statin, we'd be patting ourselves on the back with that. So nature doesn't care. If you can do it that way, that's great. The one caveat is they don't go through the same regulatory processes in terms of safety, etc. So one of my patients, I remember, she was on red yeast rice. She didn't want to take statins, wanted to do this in sort of an alternative way.
Sure.
And then saw a report that in Japan there were 7 cases of acute renal failure of patients taking red yeast. And that's because there was a pollutant, a toxin that had got in the over-the-counter. So that's the kind of only thing that we're a little bit uncertain about. But those 2 nutraceuticals would be the ones I would, I've recommended to people if they want to go down that route.
Okay.
Benecol, for example, is a plant-based sterol and reduces 7% cholesterol.
Okay. Are there any particular diets, like the portfolio dietary pattern that got quite a lot of attention 20 years ago?
The Mediterranean diet is probably the only one that really has a reasonable evidence base for reducing cardiovascular disease. And the difficult thing with doing dietary trials and often is that sometimes if you replace something, if you add one thing and you take something else out or the other way around. So you don't know what the true effect is of those bits. But in terms of a type of diet, it's the Mediterranean diet.
Do you have dietitians at all that you refer folks to?
Not as many as I would like, because I think that, in the days gone by, certainly in the hospital, we would have a lot more access. We do. And it's particularly helpful in the people with high triglycerides because it's not going to make any difference to people with a high LPA. For high triglycerides, it's a big part of what we should be doing. And so invariably all of those people are. For LDL cholesterol, for example, it's not, unless somebody's got a really awful diet, which you can kind of go through relatively quickly, probably the dietary impact is going to be, if somebody's taking a truckload of dairy products and cheese and so forth, that's an obvious thing to change. Saturated fat, since that delivery to the liver I was explaining. But for most other people, the dietary contribution, when you start at a very high level, which will either have a single gene or multi-gene basis, familial hypercholesterolemia or polygenic hypercholesterolemia, the contribution of diet at that level is helpful, but it'll be minuscule compared to that person's needs. At a lower level, absolutely. But at a very high level, it matters, but it's too far up that ladder to just kind of leave it with just diet.
You mentioned familial hypercholesterolemia and polygenic hypercholesterolemia. Can you just define the difference between those?
So familial hypercholesterolemia, 1 in 311, whopping great effect from birth, from conception. And doubles, trebles your risk of cardiovascular disease, and we detect it late. And here, if you're affected, so you often see a family tree where father, mother, somebody had heart disease or cardiovascular disease early in life, 55 for men, 60 for women, 50% chance of a child being affected. So if you find one individual, then all the children should be screened. So if you do genetic testing in that individual, that takes about 3 months to test for 1,800 different variations. But in the children, you only have to look for one. So mouth swab, do that in a month, for example. Polygenic hypercholesterolemia is because there's so many genes that regulate cholesterol, you will have natural variations in them. If you're really unlucky and you've inherited, let's say, 12 variants in 12 different pathways, let's say, and each variant pushes your risk up, they're additive.
Yeah.
But the difference is for the same level of LDL, so if I take a 45-year-old who's got a polygenic hypercholesterolemia and one that's got familial hypercholesterolemia, the FH patient is more likely to have furring of the blood vessels. Why? He had, or he or she had that from birth, and the other person, the cholesterol levels probably went up in early adulthood, where diet and other patterns come in. So it's like smoking and pack years. And the difference is the polygenic hypercholesterolemia patient, their kids don't need to be tested. It's like winning the lottery ticket 2 weeks running. You're not going to come up with a winning sequence 2 weeks in a row. You'll be lucky if you get it once. So it's the opposite of that, obviously. But the chances are each of those to the power of that again.
Okay. And is there an easy way of people to determine their polygenic risks?
Well, so polygenic hypercholesterolemia is different from polygenic risk. So basically, for polygenic hypercholesterolemia, so the way we do it sometimes, so there are laboratories that do that.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly helpful. I mean, I saw somebody today where she got high cholesterol levels. She was worried about it being FH. And the conclusion was, we've tested, it's not, but high probability of polygenic because the number of SNPs that she's got, the variation.
Gotcha.
She's got enough of those to explain that. So the good news for her is that kind of explains why her coronary disease isn't that as bad as it might have been. And it also means her kids don't need testing.
Okay.
But it's a genetic test.
Yeah.
And you can either do it in one of two ways, get the result per se, and it specifically says high polygenic likelihood, or at the moment, sort of the cheap and cheerful way is if your cholesterol level's high enough and your LPA isn't high, and if your LDL is high and you screen for FH, it's not FH, it's going to be polygenic.
Gotcha. Okay.
By exclusion.
Okay, by exclusion, yeah. If someone wanted to specifically go, are there labs or genetic?
So they are commercially available. So I tend to, so here, for example, we'll use the Great Ormond Street, but they don't tend to do the polygenic. So I use a laboratory in Bristol. It's the NHS lab in Bristol. I send all my private samples there.
Gotcha. Okay, fine. So you'd be able to find one online.
You should be able to. I'm always a little bit kind of, I've stuck to the people that I know and the quality metrics, etc. And it's one of the national centres that, they'll do NHS and private work as well. But there are a lot of labs around, and I'm not completely sure what the quality control is. So there are plenty of people who've had a 23andMe test done, and they haven't actually got all of the SNPs looked at there. So,
and I guess it depends on the quality of the sequencing as well. That's super helpful. And so fat attenuation index, we talked about that, calcium CT score. My understanding of the calcium CT score is that it's quite late.
It is very true.
If you've got calcium, that's
So think about it. It's a late stage in atherosclerosis. So basically, let's say, I look at a 40-year-old and I do a calcium score. And, well, let's take another example. Let's say numbers are bad in somebody. I've got a high pretest probability. We don't routinely scan 35-year-olds, let's say. But if we did, because there's a high pretest probability, and that would kind of determine early treatment, for example, because they're not keen, but the numbers are abnormal. If you have a fleck of calcium, short-term risk is really low. Well, but you're number 99 in the room because that's abnormal. On the other hand, a calcium
for your age group.
For your age group. On the other hand, a 75-year-old having 2, they're going to be in the bottom 25%. So that's very different. So you're absolutely right. It's a late stage. And that's why, I was using the angiogram, calcium score, and the phi index is
Yeah.
the times 1050
Gotcha.
and the times 100.
Gotcha. Are there any other investigations that you would suggest if I was really proactive about my cardiovascular health that I should consider doing, or have we pretty much done it with all the bloods and the?
I think we've done it. If you know what you're doing, I mean, essentially the bit within that is if there comes a time when we can actually use polygenic genetic vulnerability score and they're available. If you knew genetic inherited vulnerability and you knew risk factors, exposures, blood pressure, all the lipid panels that we've talked about, and depending upon the age, so you wouldn't necessarily use imaging in a 20-year-old. You'd put those two bits together and you'd be able to predict their trajectory. On the other hand, you've missed that opportunity and they're now 50. And now you might use imaging to try and personalize that. So you're not kind of over-treating or under-treating. Because a lot of the stuff that we get comes from populations, but then we treat individuals. And that's how you can do that. And if you understand that triangle of genes, environment, and time at different ages, and that's what you're seeing, that person sitting in front of you, that's what you're looking at.
Okay. This has been super useful because I think, I really hope for the listener and the viewer, this gives a clearer picture of cardiovascular risk, because I think lipids are like the poster child, and I think there's this improper approach to reducing cardiovascular risk by just controlling your cholesterol. As long as my cholesterol's low and I take my statins, I'm fine. But what you've articulated today is it's much more holistic than that. You're really going to be thinking about inflammation, glucose control, all the other driving factors behind atherosclerosis. So this has been super, super useful. Really appreciate it, Professor.
Okay, no, thank you for inviting me.
This is great. Really, really good. If you want to improve your heart health and lower cholesterol, then check out this video right here where I do a deep dive into ingredients that can lower your cholesterol and potentially unclog your arteries.